Hey friends, it's time for another webinar number 3 for Be an iPad Artist. And we have lots of questions, and I'm going to get right to them and do my best to answer them. If you have any additional questions that you need answered, put them here in the comments on YouTube, and so that I know where to find them easily, just put the word question in all caps and then your question afterwards, and I'll try to get to it. We have a lot of questions that people have already been putting on the schoolyard, so I have my work cut out for me as it is, but we'll get to it. We'll get to as much as we possibly can in the next hour. So let's begin. So I have got your questions all sitting here, and you know what the leitmotif, as we used to say in 9th grade English, is among all these questions, or among a significant number of questions, is the word struggle. Struggling. A lot of struggling, and I'm sorry to hear about that. I understand it. I spent 2 years struggling myself with the iPad, and so let's struggle through your questions and see if we can get to them, because I don't want you to be miserable in the process. So, all right, let's begin here with the first question. This is from Angelica Westerman, and she says, I'm struggling with layers. Layers is, of course, the main thing that we talked about this week, week 3. She says, I cannot duplicate text and overlay it to create the shadowy effect. And also, I'd like to import a photo and trace above it. I can do that, but I cannot make the photo disappear and only have the tracing remaining. Okay, so that's a double-barreled question. Let's get to it. I'm going to start with here, the iPad. Let's get rid of this question and see if we can remember what it is. So I'm going to begin by putting in some text. So actually, I think I might even put some in advance. Did I? Hold on a second, let me just see. I prepared a little bit for today's class, and I think I may have, no I didn't. Okay, so let's begin with a full screen image, and let's go to the text, to add text. Let's put in Angelica's name, and let's edit the style, why not? I'm going to put it in the Sketchbook School font. All right, so there's Angelica's name. Let's close that. All right, so Angelica's name, as we look here, is on a fresh layer. We have layer 1 here, and then we have Angelica's name here. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate it by sliding it over. Oops, that was not what I intended to do. We're going to slide it over and duplicate it, and then we're going to take Angelica's name, and we are going to dial back the opacity because we want to make it into a shadow. So I'm dialing it back to, let's say, 50%. And now you can't see it. Why? Because it's sitting directly beneath that upper layer. 2 layers are identical, except for the one that's below, which is half the intensity. So I slide it, sliding it over, and there it is. Angelica's name with a shadow thrown. So Angelica, just make sure you've got these 2 separate layers, and make sure that one of them is opacity, different opacity, and that you've slid it down. All right, let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of Angelica. Not really, but get rid of her name at least, okay? So I prepared something here. What happened to it? Was it here? I'm sorry. Oh yes, okay. So, the other question that Angelica had was about photos. How do we bring in a photo and trace? Now, hopefully we're not cheating. Of course not. But let's bring in a picture of somebody handsome here. Let me pick here. I'll take this picture. Okay, So there you have a handsome subject for our tracing exercise. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open another layer, sitting on top another layer. And then I simply take my pen and I do a drawing, a tracing. Here we go, nice and fat. Give him some glasses. And now I get rid of my original layer, and there is the trace drawing. Okay, so make sure you've got them on two different layers. Make sure the drawing that you're tracing on is on the layer above, not below. And that should do it for you. All right? Hopefully, Angelica, you're watching this and you benefited from that explanation. Good. All right, next. Hopefully that struggle is over. Let's see. Why is creating a masking layer, Janice McCarty asks, different from just using the eraser tool for the same effect? I'm sure there is an advantage to using the mask, or this extra step would not be necessary. Well put. There is a big difference, in fact. And let me try and demonstrate that for you. Because the big difference is what we call non-destructive editing. I'm not sure if that's exactly the term, but non-destructive is certainly the correct term, meaning that you can make edits, make changes using a mask without destroying the thing that you've done before. So let's have a look here. So let me just get rid of this question. So here we have just a random shape that I've drawn, and I go to the layer, and there it is sitting on that shape. And I go and I create a mask. So now I have this layer that's sitting above it, and I'm going to draw. So I want to say the word mask. Okay. Now, let's say I want to do something different. Actually, there's that word mask written on this layer, and I can remove it. Now let's say I didn't do that. Say I just did this with the eraser and I did the word mask. That is now a permanent part of this yellow circle. I can't change it. I can't get rid of it. It's stuck there. So the mask allows me to to change my mind without destroying the work that I've done. So, I can undo it, but let's look at that mask again. And now I could take this mask and I can decide that, what I want to, actually I want to remove some part of it, Whatever I do to that mask layer, again, is not changing my bottom layer. So that's the difference. Masking allows you, there are other things that masking allows you to do, but the big difference between that and just using the eraser is you can change your mind. And that's often a very useful thing to be able to do. Okay. Mitzi Benek says, in the lesson masks at about 2:30, that's into the not 2:30 o'clock, but 2:30 into the video, you discuss a layer mask. I get the part about using black to create the masked areas and then painting with white to erase. Mine's just not working. Did I miss a step? Okay, so I kind of just went over that, but let me just make it clear again that what I was doing. So I'm gonna clear my mask layer, and I'm gonna go back. Whoops, let me get rid of the question. So again, I'm choosing black first. So when I look at the mask, it is in black. And now I'm going to pick white. And I'm going to just make some changes in here to the mask. And again, when I look at my mask layer, as you can see, that white is in there as well as the black. So the black is acting like a mask, and the white is essentially erasing the erasure, which is the mask. So think of it as just a pure black and white thing. If you paint in other colors, it will still function as a black and white mask. So that's the way that you do that. Okay? Hopefully that was clear. Care says something is way too complicated. Okay. Care, if you tell me what it is, it's way too complicated, I'll be glad to try to explain it. But it is, masking is great. It's a really useful technique to use, to incorporate in your bag of tricks. So, Eliza asks, can you explain multiply? I can't figure out what it's doing. Okay. So multiply is one of the kind of states that a layer could be in. So what it allows you to do is, there are three types of states, conditions that a layer can be in, which are related to each other. And those are multiply, screen, and overlay. Let me just show you what those three things are and how they work. Okay, so first of all, what I've done is I kind of prepared in advance for this, and I have these three different layers, but you can't see them right now. You can only see the multiply layer. Why is that you can only see the multiply layer? Because the background is white. So I'm multiplying over white. Well, what happens when you multiply? Well, multiplying is, it is literally, this is too technical perhaps to explain to you fully, but what it is doing is it literally is multiplying the channel below it by the channel that you're multiplying by. So what that means is that if you have a pixel on the layer, the top layer that you're using to multiply, what it's doing is it's multiplying the value of that pixel by the value of the pixel directly below it. What does that really mean in human terms? Well, here I'm going to put a photo of me underneath all this so you can see what happens. And when we take the multiply, what's happened here is, so the word multiply is sitting on my face, and as you can see through it, you can see that it is sort of like a transparent thing, but what is underneath, directly underneath for instance, where my eye is made a little bit darker. So it's multiplying whatever's underneath it by this green layer. All you really need to know is that when you use a multiply layer on top, it's going to make what's underneath it a bit darker, darkened by the color, kind of like a transparent sheet of green plastic, okay? Now, if we use screen does the same thing, but in reverse. It makes it lighter. So my screen layer is going over whatever's underneath it, below it, and making it lighter. You see? So that's lighter than what was there before. So this is a way of just lightening up the layer below in some predetermined way by whatever you made the mask. And overlay is kind of a combination of those two things. So with overlay, when it's lighter than the color, it becomes lighter still. And when it's darker, it becomes darker. You see? So, and if it's the middle of the range, if it's the same tone value as the color that you've put on top, it remains the same. All right? You may be wishing you hadn't asked me, but the fact is that it is relatively technical. But let me show you again. So here we're looking at it with a solid color underneath it. Okay, I took out the photo of me and I put the solid color. So you can see that the word multiply is much darker than the pink background. The screen color, the yellow, is much lighter than the background. And the overlay is kind of, sort of the same value. That's why it almost disappears. So, but what happens if we put a darker layer there as well? So now you can see that overlay is kind of lighter on the pink and darker on the dark blue, whereas multiply kind of remains the same. You know, I don't know that you need to fully 100% understand this. A lot of times what I do is I'll simply kind of mess around until I get there. But it's good to know sort of general principles, and I'll often use overlay and multiply as alternatives for just seeing like what is it like to slap on another color. It's kind of like if you're doing watercolors glazing. You know, it's putting another layer of color on top of what's beneath it. Good. Okay. Now, if you'd like even more intense understanding of these blend modes, there's lots of sources for them, but I found one that I think is pretty clear, which is on Wikipedia, of course. And if you go to the schoolyard, the questions below the comments, the questions below the announcement of this webinar, it's an event, webinar, third webinar, I've posted this thing. I'll put it here again, and that way you can go and look it up yourself if you don't happen to go to the schoolyard. But I would say, or just go to Wikipedia and look at, just search for blend modes, and you'll see it there. So here we go. So yeah, so there it is, just Wikipedia blend space modes. Alrighty, let's get back to your questions. All right, another struggle, this time with Barb Mies being the victim of the struggle. I'm struggling with a whole overlaying of colors. For now, why did you put a Photoshop chart on the overlaying colors lesson? I don't understand how to read the chart to help me. I realize that I'll need to explore this on my own, but I don't even know how to begin. I apologize, Barb. I think that you're right. I think that I made a blunder perhaps by sharing that Photoshop chart. It was admittedly quite complex. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have done that, but I did. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, let me just quickly show you what that chart looks like. It is, the fact that it's from Photoshop isn't really the issue, because Photoshop's different blend layers, blending modes are pretty much like Procreate's, but here's this chart, and you know, it's kind of hard to get what the hell I was doing with it, admittedly. So here it is. It's very complicated, but it can give you a general sense. To me, it was sort of useful. I looked around to try to find one that existed for Procreate. It doesn't really exist. I think the problem with these kinds of charts in general is that they're so complicated, the situations are so complex with how these different layers interact with the ones below, that to have one chart that explains one way how that thing is going to work is virtually impossible. So I think this is a valiant attempt at it, but I think in the end, you have to kind of experiment, and you have to kind of come up with what are the things that work for you. You know, so I like, there's ones that I use quite a lot. I use soft light quite a lot. I use multiply. I use color burn sometimes. I use luminosity when I'm making shadows. So this is just kind of something that I've come up with over time, but it's really up to you to sort of decide how you want to work about that. Okay, so there we have that question. Is there a difference between merging down layers and grouping them? Yes, there is. When you merge a layer, so here's a layer, here's another layer. When you merge them, you're essentially making that top layer become the layer below. So if you did a drawing of a line on one layer, that line will now become part of this layer, and that top layer will go away. So they're no longer separated. Now that layer is joined together. It's something that I do quite a lot, because there's a limit to how many layers you want to deal with. There's a limit to how many layers the memory of your iPad can deal with. So sometimes you do merge them just to get rid of them. You were trying something out, I like it, I'm going to merge it down. I don't need to edit it again. Grouping layers means that I take that whole group of layers and I can turn it on and off, or I can move it all around together. But if I then want to break them apart and separate them, work on them separately, I can. So those layers are sitting on top of each other, and the whole thing is moving together as a group as opposed to floating separately. But when they've merged, but if I choose to, I can separate them again, I can rearrange them, I can do different stuff to them. So grouping is temporary, merging is more permanent. Of course, you could undo and therefore separate those layers, but there's a limit to how far you can undo. And of course, if you've closed your file and reopened it, all the undoings have gone away. So then you're set. You're gelled. Francie Petraka asks, can you please show how to adjust the background color, opacity, etc.? It doesn't seem to have the same options. It doesn't. The background color is one color. So it's kind of like the wall behind you. You can't change it. You can change the color of it, but you can't do anything else to it. You couldn't change the opacity to it because there's nothing behind it, right? It's the end, it's the bottom. So if you made it semi-transparent, what would it be revealing, right? There's nothing below it to see through it. So that's why it's permanent. Now, what you can do is you could say, you know what, I'm not even going to deal with the background layer, and you could create a layer that sits on the bottom and fill that with a color, and then you could do stuff to that. So you can not use the background layer if you don't want to for some reason. Perhaps you want to export your JPEG, or you want to export your TIFF or your PNG and have it be transparent or semi-transparent. In that case, you would eliminate the background layer, and then you could make it translucent. Is that clear? I know that's kind of a complicated question, the answer in the abstract, but if you are tracking with me, if you have some other reason for doing that you haven't explained, then let me know and we'll deal with it. Okay. Christy asks, what are some of my go-to or favorite Procreate brushes for things like sketching and shading and so forth? Well, let's have a look at that. There are a lot of brushes that come with Procreate, and they're great. I have gone out and found a few brushes of my own, not of my own, but of other people's that I like, and I can tell you a bit about those. But I would say generally, I like to use the Studio Pen because it has some variation in it, so you can push and pull, and you can get that change, which is nice. And that's the Studio Pen. I also like the ink bleed pen as well, because it has sort of an organic kind of feeling to it, and it has these kind of rough edges, so it makes it look less digital. So that's the Studio Pen. And what else? I like the Nico rule thing. I use that quite a lot. And that's nice for shading. But then there are also a couple of kinds of brushes that I like. There's a woman named I forget her first name, but her last name is Bardot, and I have several of her pen sets. She has one that's called I think it's called Mid-Century Illustrators Kit. And again, in the schoolyard, I've put a link to to her website where she sells these, bardotbrush.com, and I think that she has great selections. And here's some of the pens that I like from her. So one of them is this Bardot crayon. I like that one a lot. I also like these dots because they're sort of organic looking. And what else do I like of hers? This square bleed I use quite often too. So again, it has bleeding edges, but it's kind of bigger and thicker than the pen that comes with Procreate. And then another sort of manufacturer of pens that I like quite a lot is called Rad and Happy. And this is probably the pen that I'm using the most these days. Sorry. It's actually a calligraphy pen, but it is juicy and fat. It's like drawing with a big, I don't know, like a flare, or it has you see how round the tip is? And it's also very sensitive. So it's really designed for calligraphy, so you can also pull and push, so you can do that kind of thing. and it's very nice and juicy. So I like that one quite a lot. And I'll put that down too. So radandhappy.com, and this is called her Rad Happy Procreate brush set. Again, put both of those on the so you go, basically what you do is you go to the website and she will explain step by step how you get them, how you buy them, how you pay for them, how you download them, how you put them into your iPad. They're not expensive. They're like $10 to $12 for a big set of lots of different ones. But those are two that I like. There's lots of other suppliers and providers of these things, but those are two that I use quite a lot. So that's the answer to Christy's question. All right, Anne says, I've yet to find a pleasing way of smudging or blending on the iPad. It always looks ugly and artificial no matter what brushes I've tried and opacity. My solution has been to just not smudge. You know, I think that's a really good question, and I don't have a great answer to it because I don't really use smudge very often at all. The only time I'll use it is generally if I'm working with something that's painterly. So if I'm using the oil painting brushes, then I will go in and do it very judiciously. It's kind of like when you do pastels. You know, if you're I think good at pastels, you limit your smudging and you try and keep your colors clean. It's the same thing with watercolors. If you keep rubbing your brush on a glaze or on wet, it becomes murky and muddy. And I think the same is true for the smudge brush. So I would use it judiciously. I use it around edges. I use it to do a bit of blending. But I think despite the fact that there's an endless number of brushes, I haven't found it terribly useful. And I think, in fact, where I've been going with my own art has been more in the direction of kind of bold, flat colors. So smudging really is less of my part of my kind of way of working. But that would be my suggestion, is just be judicious and experiment. Okay. Kit says, I've somehow managed to collapse the layers of a vase of flowers into one layer. I've double checked and it's not formed a group. Do you know of a way to retrieve the components' missing layers? Also, how can I prevent this happening in the future? Okay. The bad news is you probably can't retrieve it. If you've closed the file, as I said before, kind of undoing is no longer an option. So you're stuck with that one layer. In the future, what you could do is when you're working on a layer and then you're getting ready to introduce another layer, lock the first layer, right? And when you lock it, you can't change it. You can unlock it, of course, later on. But if you lock it and then you move to another layer, you won't accidentally do something on that first layer, and you'll just kind of keep it the way it is, pristine. Then you work on your next layer. You could lock that one. You could lock them progressively as you work together. That's a way of making sure that your work process keeps everything clean and separate. And but unfortunately, undoing, there's limits to what you can do. And in this case, I'm afraid you're screwed. Let's see here. Kit has a lot of questions, but this one is a good one too. Would it be possible to share some screenshots of the lists of layers that you use for some of your drawings or paintings? I, for one, would find it very useful to study some of your own lists of layers, ticked or unticked, to see the choices that you made. I'd be happy to do that. I showed so many drawings and paintings in this course. There's like several hundred of them. So if you just tell me a couple that you'd like to know more about, I'll be glad to upload them to the schoolyard and to share screen grabs with them. Unfortunately, they won't show the opacity layers necessarily, but they will show what the layers are. And, I would say multiply is mainly what I'm using if I use anything. So you'll see a fair amount of that. But just tell me what you'd like to see, and I'll be glad to take you behind the scenes and reveal my many secrets and wondrous accomplishments. Joan asks, this is a question I think from the previous week basically. I've been struggling to use the perspective tool. When I go to start actually drawing, I no longer see the grid lines for the perspective. Could you please do a simple one-point perspective of a street with a sidewalk and buildings along each side going into a vanishing point on the horizon? All right, I'll do this quickly. don't really have time to draw an entire landscape for you, but so we go to the wrench. Excuse me. Just clear everything. We go to the wrench, and we go to canvas, and we turn on the drawing guide, and then we edit the drawing guide, and we go to perspective, and we make sure that we have the thickness there. First, we have to tap to create a vanishing point. So there's my horizon, there's my vanishing point. I'm going to put it in the center, and let me just get rid of Joan's question here so you can see what I'm doing. And then I put on assisted drawing down here. I go to done. Now what you'll notice when you go to the layer is assisted drawing is now an option that's clicked there. You can unclick it if you want to. So if you want to work on it a bit and then turn it on and off, you can. All right, so I'll just do this kind of crudely, but here is, let me get a thinner pen. Okay, so there's one side of the street, and here's another side of the street going down, and let's draw a building kind of crudely. Here's another building kind of crudely. Building. Obviously getting smaller as I go, and then on the other side, same deal. And Procreate is kind of controlling these verticals so that and the horizontals so that they kind of follow the perspective line. And then what I could do is I could turn off assistance, and then I could go in and I could, do some more stuff to make these feel more dimensional and so forth. I could also set a second vanishing point. So if I go back to the vanishing point, I could also set a second vanishing point, and that would also give me, not only the horizon, but also like how is it going off to the side. So, but that's roughly how you do that. I'm not sure if you had a problem. It may be that you didn't have drawing assist turned on. It may also be that you didn't have your drawing guide. You can make the lines thicker here by sliding that and make them more opaque so you can see them more clearly. Maybe that's what you didn't have turned on, but the basic principle is pretty simple. It's not an incredibly useful tool, honestly. I hardly ever use it, but there you have it. Good. Penny says, I'm struggling to find time to keep up. I'm worried that I'll probably have questions after the course is over. When we no longer have Q&A sessions, will we still be able to ask for support and advice? Well, within limits. There's an awful lot of people in this class, so there's a limit to how much of this I can do. However, I am thinking that next week is the last scheduled week of the course, and I realize we've gone through an enormous amount of stuff and lots of videos and lots of lessons, and it's all accumulating. I totally get that. What I'm thinking is maybe we don't have a webinar next Friday, but we delay it for a week or maybe even 2 weeks. So I'm going to post in the iPad group inside of the schoolyard, I'm going to post a little survey, and you guys can decide. Do you want me to do this next Friday, or do you want to wait a week or two? Or do you have some other suggestion as to how I can answer these questions for you? Because I totally appreciate that there are more things that you're questioning, there are more things you're learning, and there's an awful lot of stuff. So I want to be helpful, but I want to make it all manageable. So, all right, that is all the questions that were on the schoolyard. So let me see now if there are any other questions that I can answer. Okay. So Cheryl's question is, how do you ungroup layers? All right, so let me go back here. Let me show you. So basically, if we have layer 1, and then we're going to put another layer which we're going to call 2, and then we'll put another layer that we'll call 3. And now we're going to slide these layers and we're going to group them. And now all these layers, oops, are now in a group that can be moved together. Okay, so you understand how a group works. Let's make it a bit smaller. We can do anything we want to. Anything we do to one of them, we're doing now to all of them. But how do we ungroup them? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a layer and we're going to drag it up and we're going to drop it. We're going to drag it up and we're going to drop it. We're going to drag it up and we're going to drop it. And now they're no longer in this group. In fact, we can just get rid of that group. And now they're all individual, independent things once again. So just dragging and dropping, moving them around. If you don't want them in the group, pull them out of the group. And that will get rid of that. Okay? Where are we now? Janice says, when changing the color of the background, can I only choose colors from a palette? I can't seem to pick the color in the little circle on the upper right. All right, let me see if I can understand that exactly. So you want to change the color of the background, so you go to background layer, you go to background color, and then it's the little color, the color picker color is the one that is going to be your layer, your background color. You just have to make sure that you're on it. So you go to background color, and then you pick a color, and there it is. So if you wanted to use the black, is that what you're saying? So right now my color picker is black. How would I do that? I'm not sure exactly. I'm not sure why it would be a problem. Just go to black, go to background color, and then pick black, and now your background's black. So yes, the color picker, I guess in this case, is not really the place to go. You have to pick a pure color. So there's, hopefully that explains it. But I'm not sure why that would be a huge problem. I mean, you can use any color you want. So you could just go to whatever your color picker color was and find it in the palette and just do that. I mean, you can have an infinite number of colors. You can also pick from, I think you can also pick from the circle, yeah. Can't you? It's an interesting question. I've never really encountered this as a problem. I suppose what you could do is you could just drag it. No, that doesn't work either. Yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that. I'm not sure the answer to that because I've never really encountered it as a problem, but I would say drag that color into your palette, or not drag it, but here, like, look. So I have this red in the corner and I have a black background. I would just touch on my palette there, and now that color is in my palette. Then I go to my background color, I pick that same color, and there it is. A little tiny bit fiddly, but not really. So that will that will solve that situation. Emma, do you have to go to settings in the layers menu, or do you just cycle through them to see what effects they have? No, you do have to. I think in the new version you may not have to, but let me just show you an example of what you could be doing. So let's go back to our little ugly page that we were making before, and so I can go to layers, and I can just click on them that way, and they are, in this case, they're not really doing anything, but you can see how that layer is changing. I'm just touching on it, and I'm just, so I am cycling through it, if that's what you meant. So yeah, you don't have to open it and close it. You don't have to go to settings. You just tap on it and click on it there. I think that answered your question. You just cycle through them to see what effects they have. Yeah. So you don't have to go to, I'm not even sure what you mean by settings. Am I missing something here? Yeah, I don't think you go to settings. I think you do what I just did. If you're asking if there's some way you can like double tap your way through it, there probably is. There probably is, but that would mean that you would have to like personalize your menus in some way, and I rarely get into that myself. Okay, D. Struboscher. when I duplicate an object, i.e. I draw a window in a building and I copy it so that I can have identical looking windows, the copiers are lower resolution. What? How do you, I'm not sure why that would be. I don't think that they would be lower resolution. No, they're the same. They're identical. They're identical layers. So if you're copying them, I mean, I would just, let me just show you what I mean by that. I would, if I wanted to, for instance, copy the layer 3, I would duplicate it and duplicate it, and then I would have a bunch of them. Oops. And then I might merge those layers down just so that I have kind of one thing now, and I would duplicate that again, and they're the same resolution. When I zoom in, they all look the same. I'm not quite sure what you mean. It's not a problem I've ever encountered. Maybe I'm missing something in your question, but that's my answer. So let me know if I can tell you something else. Okay. Janet says when she saw the Photoshop chart, she just scrolled past it. Maybe another time after I better understand Procreate. Perfectly valid response. You know, as I assumed that there would be all kinds of levels of people doing this, and some would be interested in all the fiddly bits, and others would kind of figure it out on their own. Janice says, when I create a group and then I try to make a second separate group from layers directly below, I still have just one group which includes the new layers. What am I doing wrong? Well, let's see if I can walk my way through that question. When I create a group, so let's create a group out of these two, group, and then I try to make a second separate group from layers directly below. So I click this one and I click that one and I make a group. So now they're two separate groups. I think what you're doing is you're accidentally adding this layer to your previous group. Maybe you're doing that. Or maybe you have this groups highlighted already, and then you do this, and then you do group, and they're now part of the same thing. And now you have a layered group within a group. It could be that that's what you're doing, that you have the previous group already selected, and then you're selecting what you want to be in the next group, and when you group them, it assumes that it means, oh, you want these all to be together. So just make sure that you haven't selected another group and that the only things selected are the things that you want to go into the group. Hope that answers that. Hi, Meg. Let me see if I can answer your question. I notice that some pens allow you to make a line smooth by holding down. How do I control this? Okay, so what you're referring to is a drawing assist feature that exists in every pen, I think, as far as I know, every pen. You just have to make sure that you've selected it and that you can have it on all the time. Because essentially what you're using is what is it called? You're using Quick Shape. Is that what you're using? Yeah, Quick Shape. So Quick Shape is this feature. So when you go to Actions and you go to Preferences and you go to Gesture Controls, you choose Quick Shape and Draw and Hold. So Draw and Hold is, I think, what you're describing. So, and you can change how long you hold before that feature comes on. But basically, any pen that you use, as long as you actually have this layer selected, what is going on here? So yes, so let's create a new layer, and any pen that I use turns that. So as let's turn everything else off. So as I draw like this and I hold, it straightens it out. And that's going to be true of any pen, as far as I know. I might be wrong, but I don't think I am. Okay. here you have another question. When I use the disk to choose a color, I can't seem to be able to pick the outside color. It only lets me pick from the inner disk, not the outer ring, which looks brighter. Okay, so again, I think what you're talking about is you can pick any color here, and then you can pick any color here. So I've explained this before, but basically this outer color, this outer ring allows you to pick what kind of color is it. I want it to be green. And then this inner one is allowing you to pick dark green, light green, you know, all the way to whitish green. So two different variables. One is your hue and the other is your tone. So you have to use both of them, but you know, you can pick this one and then you can pick different ones, and you can of course build a palette that way. Same hue, different tones if you want to, or same tone, different hues. So just use both rings in short. How do you change the resolution of a canvas once you've finished? I haven't done this very often, but I would say basically you go to Canvas and you go to crop and resize, okay? And then you choose resample. And then when you increase your resolution, so I'm going to increase this resolution to 6,000, let's say, it also, you know, it makes sure that the length and height are the same, and it resamples it. So now the resolution is commensurate with the new dimensions. So it's all the same, but it's larger. That's what I think happens. That's what I understand it. You'll notice that when you do that, your number of layers has diminished. So whereas when I had, say, 1,000, that's kind of crazy. When I have, say, 1,000 or 700 by 525, I have 128 layers. And if I increase that by add 0 to it, now I have 10 layers. So the file size, I guess, is the same, but the depth of it varies. So it's almost like a three-dimensional object, and as you make it bigger, it squishes thinner and has fewer layers. But the resolution can be expanded by simply using resample. Oops, I've just accidentally resized my canvas, but anyway, so that's how you do it. I just tried using select and copy and paste to make copies of an object. When I finally pasted, I couldn't move it without distortion. Is this the proper way to use a layer as you just did? All right, I think what you're doing here probably is you are, when you're selecting it, you're using, all right, so here I've created this object. Now I've selected. Now if you're on freeform, down here below, get rid of your question so you can see my answer. When you use free flow, it gets distorted, right? But if you use it on uniform, then it remains the same. So just make sure that you selected the right type of thing. And if you distort it, you know, then it'll be even weirder and wackier. Or you can just reset it back to where you were, use uniform, make it smaller, and Bob is your uncle. All right. If I use part two, if I use a layer to copy an object, can I rotate the layer? You can rotate the object on the layer, so you're not technically rotating the layer, but let's say we duplicate it. We now have two layers. You can take this other, oops. You can take the contents of this layer. You can use this green thing at the top to shift it, or you can do it by hand. So here I'm doing it by hand, and here I'm using the green thing, and then you could theoretically put it on top. And you know, so if you wanted to make a pattern, let's say, you could certainly do that. You could create one object. Okay, let's try it. So we can now, or you can also use down here, it says rotate 45 degrees. So you can do it in increments. That might be an easier way for you to do it. I think magnetics might have something to do with that too, but I'm not really sure. Yeah, magnetics does it in little tiny increments. So yes, lots of great options there for creating patterns and doing stuff like that. Meg says, if I want just a pure hue, how do I select it? Okay, so you just go to the purest part of the hue. You could also go to value, I think. Or is it classic? Yeah, so classic, you can just go right to the top corner. And there you pick it, and it's the pure hue. There's probably some way with value as well, but I don't know enough about that. But disc, as you can see, when we've picked disc, this is basically doing it up here, you know. But classic, I think, is more correct. You see, it's more specific to that. So now you have this pure hue. Okay. Dorothy wants to say, is there a way to keep the pen black without picking it from the disc each time? Well, Procreate doesn't consider black to be necessarily a particularly special color. Like in Photoshop, black and white are kind of built into your menu when you do color selection. There's a black and white always selected there. Procreate doesn't do it that way. But let's say I was using black, and then I switched to yellow. Then I wanted to go back to black. There's a couple things I could do. The easiest way is I could just hold down in the corner. See how can you see that? Let me show you in another way. If you watch here, can you see this? Oops. If you watch in the corner, sorry about that, but you can see what I'm doing is I'm holding it down, and now it's switched back to yellow. I hold it down again, it switches back to black. So if you looked at the 10 Procreate tips video that I made recently, you will see this explained. I mean, another option is if you're using yellow and you want to go back to black, you could also hold down and select the black, and then you'd be back to black as well. So this action of holding down on that sort of square in the middle here, and then picking your color allows you to, whoops, and then let go, then you get back to black. I realize that my camera work is too snazzy here, but okay, so I'm holding it down, I'm picking black, I'm letting go, and now I've got black. Okay, good. It seems like the struggle is over. We've struggled our way through dozens of challenges, and hopefully I've beaten them all. I'm just going to do one quick more scan. If there's anything you want to tell me in the meantime while I'm looking through your questions. Yes, I don't see any questions that I haven't answered, I don't think. Good. Thanks. I continue to be impressed by the work that you guys are doing and showing and sharing. I know that there's a huge amount to learn. I had the benefit of spending 2 years learning everything that you've learned so far in 3, soon 4 weeks. So I totally understand if your head is sore and if there's lots and lots of questions that you have. So, but hopefully we will meet again, maybe next week or maybe later if you prefer, and that you will continue to play with these things. I think next week we're going to get a bit more abstract. I'm going to get into some things like animation that are really fun, but even more kind of complicated. We're going to start going beyond exercises to actually making things. We're going to do a sort of a photorealistic quasi, as close as I can come to making things that look like photos. We're going to do some stuff like that, so we can really get into layers. I can give you a quick preview if you want of what that's going to look like, because I have made I think this is the one. Yeah, so this is the thing that we're going to demo next week. We're going to make this, and there's a lot of layers. For those of you who like layers, I'm going to show you lots of layers. You don't need to make all these layers, but I will. I love me a good set of layers, and there's lots of them here. And that's how we're going to get all these different things. And I think, from what I remember, there's a certain amount of fiddliness with, no, most of the layers are pretty much normal layers. Some of them have different opacities. Here's one that is a multiply layer, and here's one that is a color layer, and here's one that is a vivid light layer. And sometimes I'll mess around with layers that way when I'm doing something that's transparent and translucent, and I am fiddling with it to try and get, things like, when you see these layers that are reflecting on top of each other. That's kind of where I'll get into the more fiddly bits of making layers. But that's something that's honestly trial and error. I'd like to be able to tell you that I know exactly what I'm doing. As in many things, I don't. But I have more and more of an instinct for it, and I'll try and share that with you. And you'll see me make this actual thing. It's going to take quite a while, and I speed up some bits of it so it isn't overly tedious. But we're going to really get into what I would call, if I were a master, this would have been a master class on how to do one kind of quasi-realistic looking thing. It's a lot of fun to make these kinds of things and to really study reflections and translucence and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Eleanor says, I didn't answer my question about getting the previous brush. No, there isn't. I don't think there is a direct way of getting the previous brush. I think you have to just go and select it. At least that's my experience. But if you select from one menu and then you go to another menu, so if for instance you're looking at pencils and then you're looking at watercolor, no, if you're looking at pencils then you're looking at painting, your brush will be selected when you go to that one. So if you go to painting and you're using the round brush, and then you go to pencils and you're using the 6B, when you go back to painting again, the watercolor brush will be highlighted. So that makes it a little faster, but you can't directly jump between one and the other. All right. Good. Well, we've run out of time. It's 12:58 here in New York City. The rain has stopped, the sun is shining, and it's time to get on with my day, and for you too. Maybe I'll go and do some iPad drawing this afternoon. Hopefully you will too. And we'll continue on this adventure. So maybe I'll see you next week. It's up to you. I will post a survey in the schoolyard, and I'll look at it by next Friday, and we'll decide where and how we meet again. Okay? Thanks for all your great questions and for your patience in letting me dither my way through to answers for them.